faith groups might be more faithful to their mission without a building.
Buildings are critical to faith communities.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
And thank you, Mark. Welcome to the American Religious Town Hall meeting. We're so very glad you've joined us, especially for today's discussion. I think you'll find this topic most interesting, so stick around. It's just beginning. But before we get to the discussion, I'd like for you to meet our panelists. Let's begin with the gentleman to my right.
I'm Bishop Michael Olson, and I'm the Roman Catholic Bishop of the Diocese of Fort Worth.
Hi, I'm Carl Trovel. I'm Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Concordia University in Austin, Texas, a school affiliated with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod.
I'm Tom Plumley. I'm a minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and I serve First Christian Church in downtown Fort Worth, Texas, where we have a beautiful and historic building.
My name is Bert Beach, and I'm an ordained minister of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, living in Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. I serve at the world headquarters of our church as a consultant.
And I'm Othel H. Lakey, a bishop in retirement of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. I live in Buford, Georgia.
My name is Mel Robeck. I'm an Assemblies of God minister, and I serve the church at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California, where I am professor of church history and ecumenics.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. So glad you could be here today. I know that you're anxious and prepared for this discussion. It's going to be an interesting one. In one of the most famous lines from a great baseball movie, it was said, "If you build it, they will come." Today's question is whether the same holds true for congregations of faith. Churches, synagogues, and mosques are often symbolized by and identified with their buildings. While the vast majority still build them, there is clearly an identifiable stream of thought that they should not. Some large churches are having their buildings foreclosed on. Some small and dying congregations seem to be hanging on simply out of loyalty to their buildings and the memories associated with them. Groups such as Leave the Building, yes, there is a group that's called that, argue that church buildings too often become ends in themselves, with the cost of the structure functioning as an albatross around the collective neck of the congregation. Many, especially new congregations and emergent church groups, have resolved never to get into the real estate business, as they say. They argue that with more than 700 million people living in slums and inadequate housing in the world, the people of God should not be spending precious resources on buildings. Others, following what at least seems like the tradition of most religious groups throughout history, argue that permanent space for administration, fellowship, and shelter is a necessary thing and a true boon to the mission of the organization. They argue that a group simply cannot grow beyond a certain point without its own building. Still, others say it's okay to have a building, but there should not be excessive expenditures on making it particularly beautiful or making its facilities and appointments state-of-the-art. Today, I'm asking our panelists to consider these three questions at least. And the first is, should faith groups without buildings spend time, energy, and money getting one? The second question, should faith groups currently occupying buildings sell them and use their resources differently? And finally, can a building itself express praise to God, or is it just as likely to be a source of such conflict as to serve as a negative witness to God? Let's return now to those who made the opening statements to begin this program, and for that we go back to Reverend Plumley. if you could please tell us a little more of your thoughts on this subject.
Thank you. This is a subject close to my heart because the congregation that I serve is currently in a building that's on the National Registry of Historic Places, and it's 100 years old. The congregation's 150 years old, and sometimes taking care of that building is seems like an albatross around our neck, but it's usually not with congregations like mine, but with newer congregations. They're finding a lot of flexibility, a lot of mobility to do various kinds of mission and to be less concerned about some things that those of us who have buildings have to be concerned about. When they can be not in the real estate business. I think of the martyr Stephen's statement quoted in the 7th chapter of the book of Acts, where he says, God does not dwell in buildings made with human hands. And I think that that helps us to understand how our buildings are not, should not be the sources of our inspiration, nor should they be the foci of our adoration. But sometimes they do become that way. I think of a congregation that I was just told about in New York City that is in a ballroom in a hotel on like the 18th floor of some skyscraper that has 7 services a weekend, and to each of those services they draw 2,500 to 3,000 people. That's a wonderful witness, and it gives them all sorts of abilities to do different things than a congregation that's saddled with building expenses, paying utility bills, and so forth. And so I think that it's at least worth thinking about for congregations as they're beginning to not be in so much of a hurry to get into a building.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Trovall, you made a comment that was a little different than what we heard from Reverend Plumley. If you could elucidate your thoughts a little bit, please.
I said that buildings are critical to faith communities, and one of the reasons why I think that's important is even when you look at the history of the Christian church, you see that initially they met in synagogues where they were permitted to, and if they were cast out, they met in homes. And granted, you may not need a church building that we typically talk about, but there always needs to be a space that people worship in, because we are physical creatures. We have to physically gather at some place. Typically, we need to set aside that space for a particular purpose, namely here worship. And even when the Roman Empire fell and became the pagan Roman Empire fell and became Christian, many of the old pagan spaces that were used for worship were turned into Christian worship spaces. I guess my point here is that we are more than our physical bodies, but yet at the same time we are physical, and Christ became flesh and dwelt among us, tented among us, and we continue to make tents. Not when they become idols, that's a problem, but their proper service in the praise and worship of God, which was deigned by Jesus himself, I think is totally appropriate. And frankly, I think people can talk about being out in nature and having experiences with God, but some of my most intimate experiences that I've had in my spiritual life have come within being surrounded by stained glass and crosses and even with incense.
All right, thank you very much. Let's come down the table. Bishop Lakey, good to have you back again today.
It's good to be here. Thank you very much.
If you could give us your perspective on this subject.
Out of my experience totally in the black church, and beginning in the rural communities of the South, it's difficult for us to understand how significant and important those little buildings, those little churches were as the identifying mark of given communities. And in fact, it was all we had. The only thing that the community owned was the little church building. Indeed, the civil rights movement, it was born in the church out of necessity. There was nowhere else to be able to meet. What I'm saying is that people identify, as Dr. Froval says, they identify their faith with something tangible. They have to have something they can see, something they can touch, and that's that church building. When we took this tour of Europe and saw some of the magnificent cathedrals, and I'm sure that the bishop would know more about this than I do, but I understand that one of the reasons that the cathedrals are so magnificent was because the people were poor, and they wanted something that they would bring together their meager resources so they could glorify God, at least in a beautiful place of worship. So I think faith is often identified with the building.
All right, thank you. Let's come across to Dr. Robeck, please. What are your thoughts on this subject today?
Well, obviously, people can worship God wherever they are. I grew up in a tradition that's relatively young. It's just over 100 years old. My uncle started a church in his garage. My dad started one in a living room. My mother leased a storefront, and all of these are big churches today. They have moved on. They have built buildings that seat anywhere from several hundred to several thousand people, and I think that's all good. I do worry a great deal about the way we saddle ourselves both with mortgages and with upkeep. I think about the Crystal Cathedral. When Robert Schuller was pastor there, they paid $100,000 a year for window washers. Okay, just think about that. You have to raise that over the year in terms of tithes and offerings just to cover that. Think about air conditioning costs in the time of rising energy prices and so forth. As I travel around the world and I see a lot of churches and they do things very differently. I preached in a church in Matanzas, Cuba at one point in time that was in a living room of a house, and it was probably no bigger than capable of holding about 20 people sitting, and it probably had 80 people standing. The windows were open. There was one little fan. It was about 95 degrees. All the neighbors and all the street outside were standing outside the window listening just because it was something different that was taking place there at a particular time. You go to Africa, you have a lot of African instituted churches that meet out in the open. They meet in fields, they meet in forests, they meet in pastures. They don't have a home that they can call their own, but you recognize them because they all wear the same robes. Okay, it's the way they gather together, the way they identify themselves. You go to China. It may be churches in factories. They're not necessarily allowed to build churches in certain areas, but a person who's a factory owner or a manager is often able to start a Bible study. That becomes the church. So there are all kinds of ways that we can go at it. I think the question, of course, is where we put our priorities, where we decide to use our money. Is it largely for upkeep and maintenance, or is it for the expansion of the kingdom of God in some tangible way, whether through evangelization or through discipleship that has to do with social justice and the like? And the whole idea of aesthetics, the beauty of the church, especially in a poverty-stricken area. I mean, you can go into Soweto and find some absolutely beautiful churches, and it's precisely because this is the one thing of beauty that they have around them. Well, I think South Africa is a beautiful country, but when you're stuck in Soweto, which was really the poorest of the poor near the Johannesburg area, I think it's really important to have a beautiful place that they can say, I'm part of this. This is something that says something about what I think of the God that I serve. And so I think there are pros and cons in all directions here.
All right, thank you very much. And Bishop Olson, welcome back. Glad to have you here today and your position on this subject, if you could, please.
Well, I guess coming out of the Catholic tradition, the principle is the Eucharist makes the church. In other words, that we gather to celebrate the Mass, the Eucharist together, and that forms us in communion with each other and with God. We need a place to do that. It doesn't have to be a huge church or a big church, but ultimately that place takes on, it has to support the mission that we have with the celebration of the Eucharist, that we're sent from Mass. And so it really aesthetically and its design should be something that makes known the story, the Christian story, and also the story of that particular community as well. And so it's an important thing as far as how it manifests that. Now, it can be done in a scandalous way, in the sense of ostentatious, or it can be done in a very beautiful way, aesthetically speaking, and something that, in a sense, lasts beyond the contemporary. I think most recently, we've had a trend to build just functional buildings, and with that, we've really lost something that is important to our identity and our mission, that supports us, especially through the transcendental of beauty. I mean, there's so much ugliness in the world that it'd be nice. It doesn't replace the mission, but it needs to support the mission.
Often there comes up in a discussion like this, one of the aspects of places of worship has to do with functionality, and the other has to do with the traditions and passing on from generation to generation. It does raise some interesting issues, though, as to what is appropriate or not appropriate. Some believe, as we are hearing here today, you must give your best to the Lord. What does that mean in the context of buildings? Dr. Beach, what is your subject, or what is your position on this subject?
I have various positions. Depends where I am and who I'm talking to. But it's a very complicated issue, because I love visiting great cathedrals, the great churches in Britain, for example, they were there. But on the other hand, I'm just kind of disappointed. I come in there and they're empty. On Sunday morning, there may be only 20 people there. A colossal church, today, if you wanted to build, it would be millions and millions, I don't know, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions to build a church like that. In fact, I don't think we're going to build churches. They say that the cathedral we have in Washington, the Anglican, cathedral there in Washington, that's the last type of church of that type that will be built in the U.S. It's too expensive nowadays. It takes too long to build. If a little tremor comes, $25 million of repairs for a tiny little tremor in Washington we had recently, and so on. It's very complicated. But on the other hand, these buildings also represent something. So I'm kind of pulled. I'm not impressed with the statements that we make sometimes. Well, there are millions of people without housing, and so we should not spend money on churches and give money to build houses. I'm not sure that that's the purpose of the offerings that we have. It's just to build houses for people, so on. So I think we need to use these houses to the best possible. I appreciated the term you used a while ago of functional. A church has to be functional. A Seventh-day Adventist church that doesn't have a kitchen, that doesn't have a youth room, that doesn't have the proper restrooms and so forth, doesn't function very well. It's not only just the auditorium. So it needs functional, and it needs to be kept up. I think part of the problem we face in some of the inner city churches, these old buildings we find in Washington, D.C. that are a problem now, they have not been kept up. And now they find it costs $1 million to fix something here and there. I'm very happy that the church I belong to, it keeps on repairing things, doing this, doing that, doing this. It costs money, but that's the only way to do it.
All right, thank you. Let's come back across to Reverend Plumley.
I want to make a couple of comments. One has to do with that functionality issue. I think there are some entire movements, some entire denominations in the church that their take on buildings is functional only. Anything more is excessive. And I agree with the bishop that misses all the aesthetics and the teaching of the message itself that is translated through the architecture and through the artwork and so forth, which for centuries was very important. I serve one of those churches that you're talking about that is on the verge of being in ill repair, and we're having to spend lots and lots of money right now in keeping it beautiful, keeping it functional, keeping it working. But that we feel is preparation for the future. And yet there's another group that meets in our church that is without a building, and they're doing fine, and by many measures better than we are.
Thank you, Reverend. I'm sorry we're out of time on this segment. It went by really very quickly. But there is an important announcement I'd like for you to hear. Mark has it for you. Stand by. We'll be right back.
Thank you, Pastor Lutz. We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching. And now, back to you, Pastor Lutz, and today's closing statements.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome back. I'm sure this is a subject that is debated in many church boards and councils across the country and maybe even around the world. So it's very practical today about which we are speaking. Now, we're going to go to our summary statements, but before that, I too want to thank you for the cards and letters that you send in and appreciate your support, whether it's monetary or just sending us a word of encouragement or a suggestion for a program. We really do appreciate hearing from you. Now to our summary statements. Let's go over to Bishop Olson to begin.
I think in our contemporary times, it's important for us to have a physical place to gather to worship God in, especially because we live in such an isolated existence otherwise, that it's important for us to get out of our own worlds and come together as people, as a community, and as a church.
Thank you very much. Now, Reverend Plumley.
The vast majority of religious organizations do have buildings that they have some ownership in, some level of ownership in. And our responsibility, I think, is to be good stewards of the buildings. The New Testament, for instance, does not encourage spending resources of the church on buildings, but on spreading the gospel and helping the poor. If our buildings can help us do those things, that's where we need to be turning our emphases.
Means to an end. Thank you. Well said. Now to Bishop Lakey.
Thank you very much. There's a need in all of our hearts for a sense of place. And when we relate to God, we want to identify God with something tangible. And I think the Old Testament is quite clear that God has to be where we gather to meet God. And though we said everything we've said is true, somehow we still want that place where we believe we met God. So we need buildings that we call churches or temples or synagogues.
All right, thank you very much, Bishop. Now across to Dr. Robeck, your summation, please.
Yeah, I've been thinking about King David lately and the fact that he wanted to build a temple for God. And he and God had this conversation. Essentially, God says, I don't need a temple. And David says, but I have a house and you should dwell among us, you know. And God says, well, you know, you can get the stuff together, but I want your son to build it, you know, ultimately. And so you end up with Solomon building the temple. I think there are several questions that we have to ask ourselves as we think about the buildings that we have or the buildings that we consider building. And that is, number one, how do we measure success? Do we measure success only by quantity, how many people we can fit into a room? Or do we measure it by the quality of the program and the services that we provide? And I think that's a very important question. Second question I think that is important is when we think about these buildings that we have, do we develop an endowment to secure the ongoing upkeep of these buildings. There are some empty buildings with large endowments. They will be there forever, but they'll all be empty. Or do we simply say we go day by faith and we trust God to provide what's necessary at this point in time or for the future, perhaps in other things? We also have to recognize that laws are changing about religion even in the United States. There are zoning laws that say you can build or you cannot build or you must share buildings. The city of Irvine in Southern California requires, for instance, that 3 or 4 churches share a single building. Otherwise, they can't meet there in the city of Irvine. The question of will leases and rents, will we be able to afford them in the future is a huge question. And the question of whether or not we will even be able to build churches in the future. In Malaysia, for instance, it's against the law, so they meet in hotels.
Thank you, Dr. Robick. Now let's come to Dr. Beach.
Well, there's a lot of things that we could say, but just would like to say I think a church should be comfortable. I think a church should be clean, neat looking, warm aspect, and I hope a little bit of art there somehow.
All right. Thank you very much. And now, Dr. Trovall, your summation, please.
Sure. The church is the people of God gathered around Word and Sacrament, and the physical building is something that is there to serve the people, and it's what Lutherans use the word adiaphora. It's adiaphora. It's not commanded in the New Testament, and it's not forbidden, and so it's free for people to use to the glory of God and to the service of others.
All right, thank you very much. Well, this has been an enlightening discussion, to say the least. As I say, I'm sure there are church boards and councils going to be going back and considering these things, especially if they're looking to build their own sanctuary or temple. But we are to the close of another program. And again, I want to thank you for joining us for this discussion. I hope that you'll come back again next time. And if you are able, go onto the internet and find some of our archived programs there, which I think you're going to find equally as interesting as today's discussion. For now, the charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America, we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. And now, friends, until next week, at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. May the God of all of us bless all of you.
Until